Hello, Tansei. Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to APTN in Focus. I'm Daryl Stranger. Today, we're putting Indigenous politicians in focus. From refusing to pledge allegiance to the Crown to being the first Indigenous woman ever on a city council in the North, we have folks from all levels of government with plenty of unique stories to share. As always, we want you to join in on our conversation. You can email infocus@aptn.ca, and you can also send us a tweet at APTNinfocus on Twitter. Our first guest today is Saul Mamakwa, a member of the Kingfisher Nation. Mamakwa is in his second term as MPP for the mostly Indigenous Northern Ontario riding. Here's a look at his swearing-in ceremony.
I, Saul Mamakwa, solemnly affirm that I will be faithful and bear true allegiance to Her Majesty, Queen Elizabeth II.
The night before he assumed office in June, Mamakwa took to Twitter to say, quote, "I have to pledge allegiance to the royal family to become a member of provincial parliament in Ontario. It's so colonial. What would you do if you were Anishinaabe?" While he made the oath to the Queen, holding an eagle feather, he went on to speak Ojibwe and then made an oath of his own.
I pledge allegiance to all my religion.
Speak with us today.
Daryl, thank you for having me. Miigwech.
So first off, I'd like to know how you got started in politics. Was it something that you knew you always wanted to do one day, or did it just sort of happen?
Yeah, I never planned on being in politics. I was always a policy person, administrator, running programs, you know, whether it's at the First Nation level or at the tribal council level or even at the political territory organization level. So, it really, when that opportunity arose back in early 2018, I said no, and it came back, and it just, I never thought I'd be here, and it's been an honor to serve the people of Kiwetnu.
So, I guess in that sense, why are you here now, and why did you get into the politics?
I knew that, I think the real reason was that, I looked at how the systems of healthcare, whether it's provincial or federally, I saw how it treated people. A lot of people told me that it was broken. And, the more I looked at it, the more I saw the needless deaths, the unnecessary suffering that was happening. I knew that we had to do more. Do more because when we talk about access to clean drinking water, overcrowding the housing, the infrastructure, education, corrections, child welfare, and when I was working in health, I had to think about all the social determinants of health to be able to bring those truth-telling stories that people face on a daily basis. Because, when I was able to kind of, flip it around, whereby it's not a broken system, it's working exactly the way it's designed, which is to harm people. And to take away the rights of the people that are in those lands and those treaty territories where I come from. So that really, really, encouraged me. But also, some leaders that came to me and said, what, we need to run.
And Saul, it's very clear that many Indigenous politicians are part of the NDP party, including yourself. Do you have any explanation as to why that might be?
I'm here for a reason, and I know NDP was the first one that actually reached out to me at the beginning, in early 2018, and at that time, a lot of people were encouraging me to run for Liberals as well, and we did speak for a while, and we never came to an agreement, and I wasn't going to run. I was at a good place, in my work that I was doing at that time. I was working right beside former National Chief Ovid Mercurdy, and why would I leave that place? And and also Anishinaabe Nation Grand Chief at that time, Alvin Fiddler. I was working with him on transforming the healthcare system at that time, and so I said no to NDP. Liberals said no to me, and a lot of people reached out again and said you need to run, and so I'm here with the NDP, and I think it fits a lot of some of the priorities, the issues that we face as Indigenous people, and I think that it's not it's not a perfect thing, but it's but they've been very supportive. They are able to give me the voice, a place where I can be able to bring my voice, no matter what policy approach that they may have on a certain thing, and I'm able to give me room to be able to, as a First Nations person, to be able to stand what I believe in and what I was taught in.
Now, so you're no stranger to standing up and speaking out on certain issues. I know you had lived on very, very little money and ate very basic food in support of and bringing awareness to some of the issues in your area, and as well as there was the swearing in when you had been elected, and with the whole Queen thing. So is that can you just sort of walk us through some of what you've done and maybe why you sort of speak up in a sense?
I don't think the system here. We have to understand the system that the legislature here in Ontario, was never built for First Nations people like me, and I knew that coming in, that it was a colonial system, and so I see it every day. I walk by all day, the paintings of former people that have, who are white people, right? And I think that, sometimes, you struggle with some of the things that are happening in front of you. You see oppression in action, you see colonialism in action, and you see racism in action, and people are harmed in that way. And I remember one time, I'm in this, I'm trying to get this government to vote in favor of, to support clean water on reserve, to fund clean water. And when they, oppose it, when they vote against my motion, you get frustrated. I thought, it's a different Ontario. It's a different Canada to be able to share these truth-telling stories about what happens on reserve. And I think from that time, it was frustrating at that time, and I remember, that I made a commitment to myself, like say, "Oh Canada, God save the
right.
Queen" at that time, "God save the King," when they sing that the first Monday of each month when we're in session, like I would sit down for that. And even recently, as as last couple months ago, they wanted us to, pledge our allegiance, pledge again to the King after the Queen passed away, and I chose not to. And I think that's something. Those are some of the things I need to stand up for, and what we believe in. And because even the residential school system, it's been to become a First Nation politician during a time of COVID, during a time of when that 215 were found in Ticumloops. It was very, very tough times, right? Yeah. And and I think the system that is here was never again built for me, and I see how how the system treats people, and we live as First Nations in a different Ontario, and I think to be able to bring that voice as a First Nations person at the provincial level is so important. And because I'm here because I grew up on the land. I was raised on the land, and the land is so important to us because that's where the language, identity, the ways of life, the teachings come from the land. And, when they look at the Crown land, they're trying to, when they talk about the development, they're going after the North because we're so rich up North. Mm-hmm. We're so rich in the forest, and also the forest, and we're so rich in the forests. We are so rich in the lakes, the rivers, and yet we see the poverty on the reserves. The clean drinking water. I have 14 long-term boil advisories in my riding. Like the lack of healthcare system that is supposed to take care of people. It's a sickness system.
Yeah.
But also, I think we are strong too as well. When we talk about the ways of life of who we are as First Nations people in the far northern Ontario. Like you see the identity, the languages that are very critical of who we are. That's where the strength comes from. So that really encourages me to be here, to be the voice of there's 124 members here in the provincial legislature, and I'm just one First Nation guy, so it's a unique voice.
Well, Saul, we're running a bit short on time, so I think we are gonna have to cut the interview short right about there. But I want to thank you for taking a few minutes out of your day and sharing some insight and some of your knowledge into your career and just politics in general. So again, thank you, Miigwech, for all your time today, and have a great rest of your week.
All right, thanks so much. Thanks for having me.
Our next guest was first elected as a Member of Parliament in Manitoba in 2019. Leah Gazan represents the Winnipeg Centre and is currently the NDP critic for Children, Families and Social Development, among other roles. She sat down with Dennis Ward to share a bit of her story, and she shares some advice for anyone thinking of entering politics.
Leah, great to see you. Thanks for doing the show this week.
Oh, it's so great to be here and so nice to see you again, Dennis.
You were first elected to represent Winnipeg Centre in 2019. What have the past few years been like for you in Ottawa?
Well, look, being elected as the Member of Parliament for Winnipeg Centre really has been the greatest honor of my life. I say it all the time. I think I represent the best riding in the country. We are home of the Winnipeg Strike, for example, home of some of the best organizations in the country, and our community has each other's backs, like Mama Bear Clan Patrol, all the amazing frontline organizations that we have in the city that work together to put community at the center. But it has been a strange time. Don't forget, I was elected and then we went into the pandemic in March. Mm-hmm. So it wasn't until really this summer that I was able to get out in the community and visit with people face to face. It's been such a pleasure. I've met many people online, and I've been working hard alongside our community to get resources.
Many people who knew you before politics would know you came from academia, but maybe a little on why you decided to enter politics in the first place.
Well, some people say, like, what got you interested in getting into politics? Why did you do it? But the reality is I was really born into it. Both my parents, lifelong CCFers and then New Democrats, activists in their own right. And so I grew up in the movement. 2019, around 2018, actually, I saw the state in which Winnipeg Centre was in particular. It competes for one of the poorest urban ridings in the country at any given time. Mm-hmm. I was worried about the climate emergency, what I called a growing inequality in this country, and what I likened to a growing corporate dictatorship. One only has to look at, what's going on with inflating prices of groceries right now to know that it's contributing to greater inequality. I felt like it was urgent. Certainly the crisis of murdered and missing Indigenous women and girls I didn't feel was getting the national attention it needed, and decided to put my name forward.
What have been some of the biggest surprises for you, I guess, since entering into politics?
Well, I wouldn't say so much surprises, but I am really proud of our community and what we've accomplished since being elected in 2019. We just got good news today on the opening of Velma's House, that will be located at the Ronald McDonald House. That came about from, survivors of sexual violence, families of murdered and missing Indigenous women and girls, led by Agana Ganijik and supported by many organizations in our riding. That was just announced today. That's one example of many examples, whether it be the Thunderbird House and the Village Project, what's happening at the Bay, the West Central Women's Resource Center, just to name a few. This is a result of community working together. My job's been very easy. I'm just trying to advocate for a community in Ottawa, but it's easy to do when you represent the most wonderful community in the country.
How, when you look at the political landscape, I think we had a record number in the last federal election, record number of Indigenous candidates, might not have reached the record high of those elected, but how well does the system accommodate Indigenous politicians?
Well, look, it's not easy. Let's not forget, this is the eye of the colonial storm. I'm in the House of Commons. This is the place where they put in place the Indian Act, for example. But here's the thing. It's really bigger than me. If I'm not here, who's representing some of the critical issues? Murdered and missing Indigenous women and girls are an example. Even things on the front lines in terms of Indigenous rights. I would say, I've brought up many times in the House my concerns about what is occurring in Wet'suwet'en territory. For example, in terms of, free, prior, and informed consent. If our voices are not there, putting forward a motion, for example, to recognize what happened in residential schools as genocide. If our voices are not there, who's representing those voices? And who's taking up that seat? And so I think it's really critical that our voices are in the House of Commons, and I really hope that more Indigenous folks, particularly Indigenous women and diverse gendered folks, consider running and taking a seat in the House of Commons.
What could be done to make it more inviting for Indigenous politicians in such a colonial space, like you say?
Well, it's a difficult dance, right? Because, it's no secret. Every day in the House of Commons, my rights, the rights of Indigenous people across the country, are up for debate. I think just taking up space, it's about folks like myself, making it easier, being trailblazers in that place so it's not so difficult for ones that follow after me. And I think just knowing that our voice matters, and to really understand, if we are not taking these seats, if we are not taking these places in the House of Commons, who is going to be taking these seats? And will that person who's taking that seat, will they really support Indigenous people and Indigenous rights? So, while I'm there, I'm going to fight to lift up the fundamental human rights of all peoples, including Indigenous peoples. I do so with pride, and I'll keep pushing for justice, particularly for Indigenous women and girls and diverse gendered folks, for our Mother Earth. We are currently in a crisis, and I will do that while people allow me to do that.
Some Indigenous politicians have quit politics or had their rise to power or limited options due to systemic racism. I think Mumilak said she would have issues with security on Parliament Hill. Have you experienced anything like that?
Look, nobody says it's an easy place to be, but like I said, I think it's bigger than me. It's about, a climate emergency right now that needs strong voices for Mother Earth. It's about ending the crisis of violence against Indigenous women and girls and diverse gendered folks. It's about realizing and respecting Indigenous rights in this country, about human rights for all. It's about fighting to get necessary housing resources. In my riding of Winnipeg Centre, I'm lucky. I'm elected. I have a home to live in. Many people in my riding don't. And so I think it's bigger than me. People's lives are on the line, and for me to lift up the voices of our community with their permission, with their direction. One of my as my hashtag is community at the center, placing community at the center of everything I bring up in the House. Well, I'm honored to take on that role, and I'm willing to also accept the difficulties that come with that role, especially representing, for me, what I feel is the most magnificent riding in the country, Winnipeg Centre, and I say that shamelessly.
Leah, what would you say to someone who's out there potentially thinking of entering politics?
You know what? Don't let anybody tell you that it can't be done. I remember when I started, I had to take out first a very prominent male politician, a longtime MLA. I then had to take out the current sitting incumbent, another male, something that's very difficult. It's difficult, to take out incumbents. And, somebody gave me very good advice, my partner. He said, just focus on what you need to do. Don't focus about winning. Don't focus about losing. Just focus on what you need to do. And, that's what I do in the House of Commons. I just focus on what I need to do. I focus on, doing the right things, staying true to my values, and representing, certainly my community of Winnipeg Centre and some of the other national issues that are impacting people across the country, including issues related to reproductive justice with those identifying as women or for women. And so I'm going to keep doing that. It's the greatest honor of my life.
Well, Leah, we certainly appreciate you taking some time, and thank you for the work you do. Appreciate you being with us on the show this week.
Thank you so much for having me, and great seeing you again, Dennis.
All right, we have to step aside for a short break, but stay with us. We'll speak with the first Indigenous woman ever elected to Whitehorse City Council. Stay tuned.
Join our conversation now. Like us on Facebook on our APTN News page. Follow or tweet us at APTN InFocus, and send your thoughts to infocus@aptn.ca.
Welcome back to APTN in Focus. Michelle Friesen is a Yukon First Nations woman and is currently on the Whitehorse City Council. Her appointment was history as she became the first Indigenous person to be on the council in over 30 years and the first woman. She also ran federally before that in the territorial election and has worked for the Assembly of First Nations. She joins me now. Michelle, thank you so much for joining us here on APTN in Focus.
Thanks for having me. Super happy to be here.
So I want to start simple, and we're here talking about Indigenous politics and politicians. So I want to start with, how about you tell us how you entered politics really yourself?
Sure. So I was actually asked to join a friend of mine in an election, and was pretty surprised by that ask. I never really saw myself as a politician. I think when we think about a politician, it's really this image that kind of fits into a box of maybe coming from money or showing up in a suit or having a certain type of educational background. And so, that was something I didn't really see for myself. But when they approached me, they had mentioned, I've been seeing you do some really amazing things in the community and helping people build confidence and building community. And I think when they had said those things to me, I was able to connect more to that, to being a community builder and seeing those types of leadership qualities in myself and as something that I possessed and as something that I was using. And so that became a really important piece for me stepping into leadership and just that representation piece. And I wanted to be able to inspire other people just the way that I had been inspired. And so, I think we don't really need more politicians. We need more people with lived expertise and empathy and people who are going to lift others up around them.
So you've been surrounded by politics for a while now, having you ran for the Yukon NDP federally, right? And then you also worked at the Assembly First Nations. So what made you want to run for the Whitehorse City Council?
Yeah, so my first kind kind of step into the political world was running in the territorial election. And I still will tell you that's probably the scariest thing I've ever done. But I had an amazing time just being surrounded by people who supported me and wanted to see me succeed. And I actually came runner-up in my riding, losing by only 46 votes.
Wow.
And I think just that experience really, I found a passion and a love for connecting with community in that way. And so when the opportunity came to run for municipal government, which is the closest to our community, I just really jumped into that opportunity to listen and learn and connect with those that I'm sharing this home with again.
So you're the first Indigenous city councillor in Whitehorse in over, I think it's over 30 years, right? And the first Indigenous woman ever. So when I say that, what goes through your mind when you hear that?
Mm-hmm. So when I decided to put my name forward, I actually didn't know that. So somebody had reached out to me and said, I don't think you're the first, but I think it's been a really long time since we've had Indigenous representation on city council. And I was really shocked by that, because I feel like, especially here in the North and in the Yukon, we really understand how important that representation is. And so I did a Google search, and sure enough, the last Indigenous person who served on Whitehorse City Council was actually elected the year that I was born. So, wow. Yeah.
So why is it important then to bring in, Indigenous voices to politics in the Yukon and especially locally?
Yeah, so I think, especially being the first Indigenous woman on Whitehorse City Council, it can be really intimidating, and it can feel like a lot of pressure. And I worry a lot of times about maybe not getting it right 100%, but I think just having that voice and that perspective is so important. And I know there's been conversations that we've had that haven't happened before. And I know I've been able to ask questions that nobody else has asked before. And I just think, especially as we're working towards things like truth and reconciliation, and we're talking about traditional knowledge in terms of climate change and incorporating our elders into those conversations, we need to have folks with those Indigenous perspectives and those connections to be there, sharing their voice and showing up and speaking out. So I think it's really important to have those voices around the table.
So, Michelle, what are some of the issues that are maybe a bit unique to Indigenous people in Whitehorse and in that area?
I think, we've been working on some big pieces on this council this year. We're working on some plans that will affect the decisions and the things that we do in our community for the next 20 years. And so looking at things like our declaration of commitment with the First Nations here, the two local First Nations, Ta'anquitchon Council and Kwanlin Dun First Nation, and just recommitting to some of those items, working towards truth and reconciliation framework, which is something I'm really excited about and looking forward to in the future. And I think we've seen a really great example of that in Vancouver, with the city of Vancouver and implementing UNDRIP recently. And so I think those are pieces that I'm really excited to share my voice and bring in those community members and speak with my elders. And some of the other things that have come up this year, we've had some really difficult discussions around women's safety when it comes to our taxi bylaw. We have declared, our territorial government has declared a health emergency. And so we're talking about things like the opioid crisis. We really saw the effects of climate change this year with landslides. And so where I see the connection there is folks who are experiencing homelessness, and these spaces that they've been seeking shelter are no longer safe for them to go. And unfortunately, in all of these situations, Indigenous people are overrepresented.
And I guess getting a little more personal here is, what are some of the hardships that maybe an Indigenous politician might face as opposed to a non-Indigenous politician, or what's some of the stuff that you might have faced that some other people might not have, just in running even?
Yeah, so I think something that's important to remember, right, is that these systems that we're working in are colonized structures, and they're systems that aren't built for us, and whether it's recognized or not, they are causing harm and they are creating barriers. And I touched on some of them already, like our bylaws or the way that we approach climate change. And so I think it's hard to navigate those always. And at times it can seem really exhausting. Yeah. I've definitely even had moments where I'm like, oh, why am I even here? Like, it feels like I'm not changing anything, and you can just hit a wall sometimes. But I also need to sit back and kind of ground myself and remember that a lot of these conversations wouldn't even be happening if I wasn't there, or what the conversation would look like if I hadn't been there to share that perspective. So I think it's not only important for somebody like myself who's an elected representative, but I think we need to be working on the inside as well. Like, we need to have that representation and that recruitment and that advancement for Indigenous peoples at all levels within, and just working towards building a better future together for our next generation. So especially now as a mom, I don't want my son to be having some of the same conversations that I'm having to have today, and as well as for all children. I want to build a better future for them, just the way that those who came before us did for me.
Well, Michelle, we're running a little short on time, so I do want to ask you one final question here. Is, on the flip side of some of the downside, is you had just touched on it a little earlier, is what can you and other Indigenous politicians bring to the table, at these local, provincial, federal levels that some others just can't?
I think it just really goes back to that perspective. It's a different perspective that we can offer, and we can share our histories and our culture, and those conversations are really important when we're shaping these systems and trying to take down some of those barriers. And I think, just that representation piece for me, again, is so important, because I didn't see myself in this role, and I'm so thankful that I had people around me who saw that leadership in me and who supported me to get here. And I really think it's important to tell people, when you see that they are making a difference, they're having an impact, that they can and they should be doing this too, because their voices are important and what they have to say is important. And we need to be around the table and be sharing our perspective and our voices, especially when decisions about our futures are being made.
Well, that's certainly well said, Michelle. We are going to have to leave it there as we're a little short on time here, but I want to say thank you, Miigwech, for joining us here and sharing your insight and your knowledge into some of what you go through, and some politicians as well. So thank you.
Yeah, Shoni Thun, thanks again.
All right, we have to step aside one final time, but stay with us. More Indigenous politics talk is on the way. But before that, here's a clip of Dennis Ward speaking to Betty Nippy Albright on Face to Face about her experiences as an MLA in Saskatoon Centre. If you want to see the full episode of her interview with Dennis, go to aptnnews.ca/face-to-face.
I was stalked. I had to have the police involved because I was getting threats. And I was told, I had some given information that probably wasn't the best information, where I was told, look the other way. Mm-hmm. Don't engage. But you go a whole year of having messages sent to you. There comes a point where you have to, silence is consent. So I have to speak up.
Welcome back to APTN in Focus. Our final guest today is Blake Desjarle, an NDP Member of Parliament for the Edmonton-Griesbach riding. Desjarle is of Cree and Métis descent and became the first openly Two-Spirit Member of Parliament when he was elected in the fall of 2021. Here he is now to talk a bit about the past year in Parliament. Blake, first off, thanks for taking some time out of your day to join us today.
Thanks so much, Daryl. Really glad to be here.
So you've been in your role for a little over a year now. What's the past year been like for you?
I'd say, Daryl, it's been really interesting. This last year, I think Canadians and Indigenous people have seen one of the most challenging but also most difficult times in a very short period of time. This last year, I think, is like a microcosm of how many people are feeling, how they're dealing with things. From the beginning of my term, of course, we were still dealing with the drastic and long-lasting effects of COVID and COVID-19 in our Indigenous communities, in urban centers, and particularly in hospitals. And then we went right into a really global emergency. You know, we've seen the illegal Russian invasion of Ukraine. And so we got then again, we had to recalibrate, reposition how we thought about things. Then, of course, what would follow is something that we're all in together right now, which is the cost of living crisis. It's no secret that people have done better than others throughout this crisis. And the people who are doing really good right now are folks that I hope spend the remainder of my time in this place holding accountable and making sure some of that money gets back in the pockets of Indigenous communities and Canadians.
Now, is there anything that maybe surprised you when you entered politics where you were like, wow, you know, I didn't know this, or this isn't how I thought it would go, or something like that?
Interestingly, I guess my expectations of the place were already kind of, you know, they weren't that high, to be really honest. You know, I'd known from working in proximity of this place, you know, before I got involved in, you know, the big house in this way, I was working with the Métis settlements of Alberta, and I was their national director for 5 years. And so I had worked with this government, I had negotiated with this government on behalf of Indigenous communities. I had known many of the things, I guess, from that experience going into my role as an MP, how decisions were made, who was making decisions, and worse yet, how sometimes the most disappointing part, I think, in my experience has been when the commitments of the government don't actually translate into real dynamic solutions for Indigenous communities. And it's a choice of the government to do that.
And how frustrating is it for you when something like that happens? Is it like, you know, you want this to happen, and is it kind of like, you know, why can't we just push this through or get this done?
Oh, okay, one of them is really interesting. I'll give you just an example of one file that I've had immense frustration with. And it's the file that I think means a lot to most Indigenous people, and my family included, which is the crisis that's facing Indigenous women, girls, and Two-Spirit folks, which is the fact that they're continuing to go missing and they're being murdered at rates disproportionate to the general public, and rates that are extreme and extraordinary, amounting to what the report calls genocide. You know, this is an emergency facing community members. Girls and women, Two-Spirit folk can't even go out, especially in Winnipeg, for example, out on the regular streets to be able to experience what this place is about without oftentimes being met with harassment and at worst times, ultimately violence. And so the government did commit way back in as early as 2019 in the budget. They said, we're going to spend $2 billion on this crisis. You know, we were pumped. I was happy about this. We need resources in the hands of people who know how to handle this emergency. We need that money in the hands of Indigenous people. But what we've noticed is actually the fact that although the government has committed this funding, they've barely spent any. And in some cases, less than 10% of the overall global budget. And so it goes to show after 7 years, their priorities, and if they have allocated the money, not spent it, you know, that's a serious concern that's misleading to Indigenous people.
Mm-hmm. And I guess I wanted to ask, you know, how does your Cree and Métis heritage sort of affect how you do your job? You know, is it something that's always in the back of your mind, especially for something like you had just talked about, trying to get things like that pushed through?
Oh, definitely. I think the way that we're raised, the way I was raised at least, by elders, community members in the Fishing Lake Métis settlement where I'd grown up, there was always a message about the community, the village raising children. You might remember that from your own community. There was a campaign in the early 90s, late 80s, where many Indigenous communities tried to reclaim culture, and there was a movement across the prairies to look at how children are in fact the beginning of something really important. And I've taken that as a lesson, especially right now when we're just not discovering, when we're reclaiming and locating Indigenous children and their bodies across Turtle Island in establishments known as residential schools, although far from it. These messages of the value of our children, compounded by the stark and dangerous and sad reality of Canada's residential schools, is something that I have to, and many politicians who are also Indigenous, like my colleague Lori Idlau, Leah Gazan, we have to deal with that. Going into that place every day, knowing that we're almost in the belly of the beast. It's an institution similar to residential schools in that it demands conformity and wants you to release those things before entering. But, you know, there have been many other people who've entered that place, like Louis Riel, for example, who had stark convictions, who said, I will be elected to this house and I will not forgo who I am. And that is the message I think Indigenous parliamentarians take every single day, no matter what party they come from. Often they come into that place with pride for their people, and I think we have that instilled in us from a young age, and it's something that we view the entire world through that lens of understanding that we have a role in this place, and we have behind us generations of ancestors who fought for the basic dignity and respect that many Indigenous communities are still fighting for today.
And Blake, I just want to go sort of back before you got into politics. Did you grow up wanting to be a politician, and being young and Indigenous, did you grow up wanting to you know, get into this and say, hey, maybe this is how I can make a change or make changes?
Not particularly. You know, it wasn't necessarily how I started out. You know, growing up in the community, we have to imagine what that looks like for some of your viewers. Some of your viewers might not have ever heard of a Métis settlement, for example. Many Indigenous people in Alberta know what they are because they're these largely big communities in terms of landmass relative to other Indigenous communities in northern Alberta. They were established in the 1930s. They were families that got together, destitute families from across the region, Métis families that gathered and tried to support one another in these Métis settlements. So I'm a descendant of this history, and understanding that we needed to find ways to survive. And so I think when I think about or contemplate how I was raised and how we could project into the future ways that it's impacted me and it's going to impact others, it's about rooting oneself in who we are that I think really helps to impact the decisions we make. And so, yeah, I'd say I missed the last part of your question, I realized, but I'd say that's part of the lens we need.
Yeah, and just the last part was just sort of, you know, how you got into it and maybe why you got into politics, really.
Oh, why? Interesting. Okay, well, I'd say it was kind of like tumbling downstairs. You're not really certain where the next step will hit you. And so I started off in my community just trying to help people. You know, I was working for Public Works in Fishing Lake, and that's where I really got introduced, I think, to seeing the deplorable conditions of my relatives, of other family members, and really basic things like this struggle to try to just get clean water into some of these homes, the struggle of trying to just repair a door or a window and not having the resources in the community to do that. Shocking. And so that tumbled into my work in advocacy at university, where I would move to Edmonton, where I represent a constituency there now, where I learned many of the histories and issues related to the impact of residential schools, 60 Scoop, and government policies that eventually contributed to what I experienced in the settlement. And so then translating that to my work as the national director, I would want to confront these systems and understand that change needs to be made. And then the opportunity arose to become an MP. You know, this was something I wasn't expecting in any way. I just kept working and working and working, and then found that people were taking notice and seeing that, you know, I was effective in many ways in trying to get some of the things that I was able to achieve during my period as national director. And then when we were able to achieve them, it was an opportunity for me to take that to the next step and see that Canada as a whole has to understand that reconciliation is a part of and a mandate of citizenship, and that there are things Canadians have to do and things I have to do to inform Canadians about that responsibility.
And Blake, we had sort of touched on it briefly a little earlier. You had talked about, there's many Indigenous voices in Parliament, and regardless of the party, just how important is it that they're bringing these Indigenous voices into governments, and why is it so important?
Oh, that's a really good question, and I hope that many young viewers in particular who are watching really take special note of how important it truly is to have representation in these places. They're not a silver bullet, that's for sure. We know that more than anyone else, that these institutions that are largely foreign to our own Indigenous governance structures are largely foreign. But that doesn't mean we should preclude the opportunity to advance our people and the rights and well-being of other persons in this country, something we've always done in this land and something that we should continue to do, and this is another way we can do it. And so that's best case scenario. Worst case scenario, it's harm reduction. We're in a place where we can call out and stop and even save lives of Indigenous people when they don't have the opportunity to be a part of those decisions. Canada has historically made decisions on behalf of Indigenous people, right down to the fact that we still have the very powerful Indian Act, which is still administered by the Minister of Indigenous and Crown Relations and the Minister of Indigenous Services Canada. These institutions still exist, meaning that Indigenous people, when precluded from those institutions, need to find space to make and be part of decisions. Parliament is a place that Indigenous people often have been neglected from, but that's changing. There's many of us now in Parliament from all parties, and any party that attempts to or restrict or even prohibit Indigenous voices is one that shouldn't belong in Canada, because most Canadians believe Indigenous people have a place here and deserve a voice here.
And Blake, what are some barriers, I guess, that Indigenous politicians might face that non-Indigenous politicians don't?
Okay, language, huge. Language is one of the biggest ones. Canada recognizes 2 official languages. It's completely neglectful of the fact that we have so many incredible, diverse, and important languages here in Turtle Island that manifest who we are as people, our mission here, and why we remain, and why that culture is so important. When we neglect at the most pinnacle institution in the country that makes decisions on behalf of people, and when the government makes a commitment that says no relationship is more important to the government of Canada than that with Indigenous peoples, we have to assume that these institutions would change and become safer places. But what we've seen is the status quo. I've seen, for example, Indigenous members of Parliament, including my own colleague, Lori Idlout, really work hard to try to find ways to include her native language, Inuktitut, in the official speeches and translation services at the House of Commons. I've had difficulties trying to smudge in this place. My own ceremony, my own swearing-in ceremony, for example, it was a whole ordeal. I think we had 14 fire marshals present at my ceremony that were required to be there. And these are the kinds of things that are not figured out yet. And these are things that we're still bushwhacking at. We know that there will be more Indigenous people to follow us. And we have to take the opportunity while we're sitting in this place to make sure we carve that path and we make a really nice path. We bushwhack that path so that the next generation, when they come through, can speak their language proudly, have the translation services ready, and even see our own laws, our own language written in the laws of Canada.
And Blake, we'll end it on this question here, kind of on the flip side of the one I just asked. What can you and other Indigenous politicians bring to the table that non-Indigenous politicians can't?
Oh, there's so much. There's a great diversity of Indigenous nations within North America. And the more Indigenous people are elected, the more we understand the deep connection Indigenous people have to this place. And we all, no matter where we're from coast to coast to coast, can learn from that. We can learn about the importance of where we are, what is truly part of this place, and we can seek to achieve unity and protection for it. I think that is the message that Indigenous people bring oftentimes to this place, to Parliament, and it's something that I think it will continue to happen. More so, I think they provide a unique lens that, like I was mentioning earlier, stops in some ways some of the harm that could be done, but also increases the opportunity to see change, to see corrections, and to see opportunity for Indigenous nations that could otherwise be left out. Because to be frank, the people who are elected to Parliament, they come from very different communities than most Indigenous folks. They don't know in many ways the reality. And so they need folks to tell them. They need peers, Some folks still in Canada have never even spoken to an Indigenous person in their life. And you can imagine what a place like Parliament would be like if it's filled with people like this. And so our presence there is important. It shows visibility and demonstrates that we're still here.
That's certainly well said, Blake. We're going to have to leave it right there. I think that's a great way to end it. But I want to thank you for taking some time out of your day to speak with us, share some of your knowledge and your insights. And again, we really appreciate you taking some time. Thank you, Miigwech.
Awesome. Thanks, Daryl.
All right, that's all we have for this week on In Focus. A big thank you to all of our guests for joining us this week. Today's episode will be available as a podcast. You can listen and subscribe on aptnnews.ca/podcasts or find us on your favorite player. And if you missed any of our past episodes and want to catch up, you can find them and more on aptnnews.ca/infocus. I'm Daryl Stranger. Thank you for joining us. Miigwech. Have a great rest of your day.